How's it going, everybody? Welcome to the show. On this episode, we're going to pick up where I left off last time, remove the oil cooler, pull off the oil pan, and take off the oil pump, along with the lower balance shaft, and then go over the trials and errors of me disassembling, resealing, and reattaching the oil pump to the front of my engine block. So stay tuned. The wire that runs down to the oil level sensor looked like it had been chewed on by a mouse or something. Not sure what the deal is with that, but I'm going to patch that up later on. The lower balance shaft was a little oily along the bottom. I don't know if it could have been from the oil pan somehow seeping upwards, but I figured again, since everything is apart, might as well pull that off and reseal that as well. And then the oil cooler didn't seem like it was leaking, but again, it was kind of hard to tell. And since I had to take all this apart to get to it, I figured I might as well do that too. So basically, we're starting where I left off last episode. I'm going to show you how I removed all this stuff. Then we're going to drop the pan and rebuild and install the oil pump. I already have the power steering pump loose because I removed the belt. So I'm taking off that adjuster bracket, removing the other power steering line, and then pounding out the bolt that goes through that pump. It has some spacers around it. And then once you get the bolts out of that bracket behind the bracket, then you can remove the bolts that go through the front of that end cap. There, I'm just removing those 3 bolts. And then after that, it's loose. I tried to see if I could just pull it off by hand. There's an O-ring in there that kind of holds it in its place. So then eventually I got the hammer and pounded it out until that O-ring had kind of broken free. And then it pretty easily just slided off the end of the shaft. I have to drain the oil out of this still. Next, I decided to remove the oil filter. I was hoping it did work. I got this oil filter wrench years ago for an old Chevy I had, and it did slip, but it got this one off, so there you go. And then while that drained out its oil, I pulled out that heat shield that's bolted to the top of the oil cooler. I didn't show you guys me doing that, but basically there's 2 10mm bolts that holds that to the top of the oil cooler, and then once the oil filter was removed, I could pull it out. Dark, isn't it? Let's see if I can lighten this up. There we go. Come on, baby. Almost. There we go. And then I put the oil filter back on for the time being, just so nothing would drop down inside that hole by accident. And went to removing the bracket for the oil level sensor. Once those bolts are out, then the bracket just comes off. There's like a plastic clip thing on the outside of that sensor, and mine was basically disintegrated. It seems all crumbly and falling apart. That's the oil pressure sensor, 7mm, and one of those leads had to be actually unscrewed. The oil pressure regulator that goes into the side of the housing there comes out first. That's pretty big. You need a 24 size socket to get that out, and I had to use an extension because the ratchet wouldn't fit in there close up to it. And then once you unscrew that, it just pulls out. There's a look at what it looks like. And then you can remove the 4 bolts that have 10mm heads on them that hold the oil cooler housing to the block. They are kind of tough to get at with the headers in place there. I ended up getting the 2 bottom ones from the bottom and the 2 top ones from the top. I took out the 2 bottom ones first, and then of course it starts leaking antifreeze. Then I moved on to the top ones and removed those. And now the housing is free from the block. The intercooler does stick into the block with an O-ring on it, so you have to pry the whole housing out quite a bit in order to completely free it from the side of the block and then lift it out. And be careful, because you're gonna make a mess, or at least I did. Oh man, how did I do that? Doggone it. So after I got done polishing the front end with some oil, here's a look at what's behind the oil cooler. You can see that rubber spacer there that I guess it's like an isolator, kinda. It's still stuck in the block there. I have to pull that out. The motor mount bracket is like right on top of the balance shaft cover, and it might be possible to loosen up those bolts and get them to come out of the cover enough so that you can then take the cover off and actually get the cover off without it wedging up against the motor mount. I decided to just go ahead and remove the whole thing, which wasn't easy because it's tough to get at those bolts too, especially with the headers in place, but I decided to go ahead and remove it. So just eventually got in there. Had to use the old extendo wrencho trick. And once the bolts were loose, took that off. And finally, we're moving on to the pan, which had me worried because these sure do look like cracks, don't they? So I guess the only way to find out is to pull the pan and see. There's just a couple of bolts that hold this flex plate cover on, and then we should be able to work on dropping the oil pan. Okie dokie. There we go. The only thing that I can't fix right now is the rear main seal, which, even if it is leaking, it's just gonna have to stay that way until maybe someday I decide to drop torque tube. See these bolts, put them in a baggie. All of the oil pan bolts have a 10mm head on them. Most of them are the same size, but the ones on the ends are longer, so you want to keep track of those. And then there are two in the very back that are a little hard to see. You got to get up in there and get those out. Well, you can't see it, but there's another one on the other corner too. These two in the back are longer over there. And you can see those lines in my oil pan there. I was worried about them because even though I had read that these pans have what look like cracks, but they really are just casting flaws. But the way those lines were on my pan, it sure looked like as if somebody got underneath there and jacked the car up by the bottom of the pan. Like, that's where I would imagine that the pan would crack. Well, it started falling all by itself. Okay. Just before I started recording. It's caught on the dipstick. I didn't pull the dipstick out. I gotta pull the dipstick out. I'm afraid if I pull the dipstick out, it's just gonna fall and hit the floor. Plastic thing went over there. I gotta find it, and I suppose I lost my O-ring. I gotta find that. Hopefully it went in the pan. So I'm guessing there's a baffle in here. Is there a trick to this? Looks like two pickup tubes hanging down. There we go. Boy, there's still quite a bit of oil in there. How much oil does this thing hold? Jeez. Luckily, after looking at the pan, it turns out that they were not cracks. They really are just marks in the casting from where the sand splits when they're pouring the aluminum. Next, I'm taking the oil pump off, but I have to get this key that's pressed into the end of the shaft out in order to slide the oil pump drive all the way off the end of the shaft so that then you can remove the pump. Now, all of these keys that are pressed into the end of the shafts for the timing belt stuff, you know, the pulleys on the crankshaft, the pulley on the camshaft, and then the pulleys on the balance shafts, all the keys are kind of difficult to take out. I knew that they were probably going to be a pain in the butt, so I just ordered new keys for all these. Even still, I wanted to see if I could get the keys out without damaging them, and this crankshaft one was the hardest. This one is really pressed in there good, and the end of the shaft is machined almost perfectly to the size of the key, so it's really stuck in there. And I thought, well, I'll try getting it out without damaging it, but even if I do, it's okay because I've got a new one. I started with the screwdriver here. You can see I kind of thought, well, that's not too sharp. Maybe I can just kind of pound on it and get the end up. But even that, it started to deform the key. So then I moved on to the wire snips. I'd read that people use the wire snips to kind of grab onto them and then pry them out. The first way I'm doing it here was not the best way. And I started taking chunks out of it, but I was like, all right, well, it's okay. I'll just work on getting it out. Finally, this is the way you want to do it. I used the largest wire snips that I had. You want to put the tips of the snips on the shaft and use the furthest back part of the jaw to grab the end of the key and then pry it up that way. That was the way that worked, and if you started doing it that way from the beginning, you might be able to get these keys out without creating too much damage, even though they are soft. So if you're going to take your key out, I'd probably do it this way. Definitely screwed that up. And then it's just a matter of removing the bolts. I've seen pictures where this larger one is a stud. Mine wasn't. It was just a bolt. So I just removed that along with the rest of them. And once you get those bolts out, then the pump is free from the front of the block. Kind of interesting. You can see where they put RTV in the corners here. And there's the oil pan gasket with Tim Dillon screaming in the background. Oh, that was easy. And now there's oil all over the floor. The pump was loose, but it didn't want to slide all the way off. And I realized that it was being held in there by that O-ring seal that goes behind that washer and in front of the oil pump drive. So I'm going to get a pick and try to pick that O-ring off. The O-ring. Hopefully it should pull off now. There we go. Or not. That oil pump drive just did not want to pull out of there, and it didn't want to easily slide off the end of the shaft. I think it was just getting caught on some of the rust that was on the shaft, and then maybe a little bit of the edge of where that key goes into the shaft. So I sprayed some lubricant in there and just kept messing with it until finally I got it to move past whatever it was hung up on, and then it just slides off. There we go. Come on, baby. There we go. Over time, the sealant that Porsche uses to seal the surfaces between the pump and the block, it ends up getting old, and because there's pressure in the pump, that oil eventually works its way out. But there is another reason why these pumps can leak. I was interested to see if mine had that problem. Oh yeah, I'm gonna have to get a new one of these. So there's the pump. So one thing they talk about is the reason why these things leak is because the girdle is not flat with the front of the block. So I'm curious to know if this girdle is flat with the front of the block, which would be where? Right here. Oh shit, that's perfectly flat. So that's good. That's really good. My old oil pump drive definitely had a little bit of a ridge in it where I could get my fingernail in there. Can just catch my thumbnail on that line. They say if that line is deep enough where you can feel it with your fingernail, then you need to replace it and get a new one. Small, but it's there. Add that to the order. Time to take apart the oil pump. So the center section is made out of steel, it has the gears inside of it, and then it's basically glued into the aluminum body of the pump. There's two screws that go down into the top. I used an H4 Allen socket to remove them. That center section is held in there pretty tightly. It's machined, basically to fit in there perfectly. And they use some sort of sealant around it. I assume it's Loctite 574 or the German equivalent. And the only way to get that thing out of there was to heat it up with a torch. This might need to be heated up with a torch. I decided to take the seal out of the front of the pump first, so I drilled a small hole into the edge of the seal, screwed a screw in there, and then used like a mini pry bar on the end of a screwdriver. Not sure what you call that tool, but used that to pry the seal out. That was easy. It was a little difficult to get this thing out of here because it's just such a tight, precise fit. I heated it up quite a bit with the torch. I wanted to heat the aluminum up as much as I could without really heating up the center section, thinking that that would expand and hopefully separate itself from that steel ring in the center. And then after the outside was hot, I took a pry bar, pried on it, but you can see that it wedges itself, so you need to lift that part out straight. And then here I'm messing with it, trying to figure out what to do, and it actually by itself started slipping out because I guess its momentum took it straight out. And then I pried on it a little more, tried not to screw anything up, and eventually it just lifted out of there. The toothed ring that spins around inside there has a dot machined on it that faces out towards the front of the motor. So that little dot right there was down. And this only goes one way. Like this. Here's a look inside the pump. It looked pretty good, nice and smooth, no ridges or wear marks or anything like that. And then I started cleaning it up. I don't know what the deal is with this stuff on the surface for the oil pan gasket. This was all around the sealing surface of the oil pan gasket. There was also silicone in the corners, which I had to get out of there also, but the tough part was scraping off whatever that adhesive was that was on the main surface. I'm not sure if they would have used a sealant like this from the factory or not. I'm sure some of you guys out there know. But either way, I had to scrape it off. It was stuck to the sealing surface, so I used a scraper, wire brush, screwdriver, until all that stuff was off of there and it was completely clean. And then I cleaned up the pump and some of the other stuff that I had already taken apart too to get ready to start reassembling this. It was hard to tell if the lower balance shaft cover was leaking or not. Definitely was a little wet underneath there, but there wasn't any obvious signs of leaks either. Either way, I decided I was going to pull this thing off and reseal it. But before I did that, I started cleaning up the surfaces of the water pump and the oil pump because I figured as I scrape that off, it'll prevent anything from possibly falling down, getting into where the balance shaft is. So I started cleaning that off first. I filled all the holes for the oil and the water with some paper towels to prevent any gunk from falling in there while I was scraping it off. Then I took a razor blade and a wire brush, cleaned that off pretty well, and then went underneath the motor and started scraping on the oil pan rails. You can see that sealant. I'm assuming that somebody must have sealed this pan before, and that's why all the sealant is on there, but if it is a Porsche thing, let me know, because I'm interested to know if Porsche used some sort of like aircraft sealant on their oil pan gaskets. Well, one good thing is the rear main is not leaking, because if that was leaking, the back of the flywheel would be covered in oil, and it's not, so that's good. The oil pan was definitely leaking, and I've just gotta like scrape off all the old gasket stuff, which is, kind of a pain in the butt. I'm gonna have to I don't know what I'm gonna do to get inside of there in that little lip to get the gasket material on where the oil pan gasket goes, but it does scrape off pretty easy with a razor blade. You can see where I've done it there. So I've just got to continue to clean this off, and then we'll move on to other stuff. I loosened up all the bolts for the balance shaft cover. Most of them are 10 millimeters. There was one bolt that was behind the header, so I couldn't remove that bolt all the way. I just left it in. And then once I had all the 10 millimeter bolts out, then I moved on to the larger ones, removed those, and now the cap is basically free except for the glue that's holding it on. And there's one dowel pin holding this on, so you need to pry it off of the dowel pin, and then it's loose, and you want to take care of the balance shaft because it's just kind of hung from the bearing in the back, and be ready for it to fall when you get that cap off. So make sure it falls on something soft, or try to catch it as you pull the cap off, because that cover is the other half of the bearing, and when you remove it, then the balance shaft wants to fall out. And you can see the sealant there on the surfaces that prevents this thing from leaking oil. I went to Amazon and got a little torque wrench for getting in there to torque the smaller bolts that require less foot-pounds than my 3/8 inch torque wrench goes down to. Echo in China. Oh, I got this one because it lists the scale in foot-pounds, Newton meters and foot-pounds, and I figured it's easier because I don't really need to deal with inch-pounds, so I figured I got the one that listed things in foot-pounds. So I got that small one, which came with a certificate that showed that it was calibrated, and even though it's not expensive, it should work good enough. And then I also got this race and bearing press or inner set. I got that one because it came with a little bit thicker handle. I got this stuff off of Amazon. And to seal the surfaces, I got this large tube, 574. Probably could have got a smaller one. And then also I got some high temperature Loctite that I'm going to put on the threads of the bolts. I matched up to the old seal. They both give the dimensions, so 38 by 52 by 7. So I cleaned up all the parts of the oil pump. There is the housing. It's nice and clean. I got inside there where the oil pan gasket goes, cleaned that out really well. And then here are the internal parts of the pump. You can see the inner ring and then the outer ring. Clean those up really well too. Here's the center section that bolts down that they go inside of, and then I got ready to assemble this thing. After everything was clean, that piece there slid nice and easy down into the pump. And when you put this together, you want to make sure that that mark on the ring there goes in the same direction that it was when you took it apart. I had some assembly lube, so I put that on the gears and inside that center section there to make sure the whole inside was lubricated until oil started flowing through. And then this process is a little tricky because you've got the gears all greased up, and then I needed to keep the outer edge clean so I could put the sealant on it. And then when you set it into the pump, you have to hold the gears into that like center part as you set it down inside the pump with the sealant on the outside. I had trouble with this thing. First of all, I put too much sealant on the housing and the ring. I didn't know it yet, but that's definitely too much sealant. And the first time I put this together, I spread the sealant on that steel ring before I had set the gears inside of it. And you don't want to do that. You want to grease the gears in the inside of that steel ring and then set the gears into it. Then put the sealant on the outer ring after the gears are already inside of it. But I'm going to do this again, and you'll see me do it that way. The other thing is definitely check and make sure that your two little screws that hold this thing in there thread into the housing nice. I could have sworn I did that. I think I maybe made the mistake of just checking one. But after I got this thing together, one of the screws just did not want to easily go in there. And I couldn't figure out why. I had sworn that I had gotten the threads perfectly clean. I thought maybe that center section was just a little bit twisted so that the screw holes weren't lining up, but the one went in there fine. Well, I ended up taking this thing all apart and trying to figure out why that screw didn't easily go in there, and I ended up just cleaning the screw hole out and getting it to go in there and calling that good. So firstly, just remember to chase the threads in the housing and be careful because it is aluminum, so you don't want to cross thread it, but you definitely need them to be clean in order to get those screws to go in there nice and easily. All right, so assembly number 2, and again, I'm making the mistake of using too much of this Loctite sealant. Now, this is the first time I'd used this stuff, and I'd read some horror stories online about guys using a foam roller and spreading it on and then getting their pumps all assembled and still having leaks. So I thought, well, I'm going to try spreading it on really thin with my finger. And there's pluses and minuses to that. Plus is, well, you end up without any leaks, but minus is that you're getting it on slightly too thick and then you have excess sealant. And of course, I had too much sealant again, and it's kind of embarrassing, showing you guys me messing with this, putting it together and pulling it apart a bunch of times, but I thought, you know what? I'm sure there's some guys out there that are watching this that haven't done this before, and showing you what I went through screwing things up and then having to redo it is probably better information than just saying, oh, there, you put this on, you put it together, and there you go. And after I get this thing all bolted together, it turns out that the gears inside there would not spin.
Oh, please tell me I didn't get too much in there. Am I going to be doing this again?
Which is disappointing, but that's what happens when you use too much.
Oh, God, you guys. Did I get Loctite or something in there? That's what it seems like, because I can't spin that thing.
And taking this apart, once you get it together, it's a pain in the butt because that 574 gets hard fast. And the only way to then take this thing apart is to heat it up with a torch and pull it apart. You can see where the Loctite squeezed down into the gears and stopped them from spinning. And you can also see I had too much Loctite on the screws, and that leaked out also.
This could have happened when I was melting it down, but it feels like there's glue on there.
I can't spin this inside here, so I'm guessing some Loctite got in between there. I mean, that thing is almost flush. It's like there is like no gap in between there. So I had to clean all the Loctite off of the housing, which was a big pain in the butt because that stuff gets hard. And it is like difficult to get off of there. It really, really solidifies. And so I spent forever scraping this thing and cleaning it up to get this put back together again. And then finally, once I had the housing clean and everything clean, I could do this. This last time I decided to just oil the gears and the inside of that housing with oil instead. So I made sure All the gears were coated and the inside was coated real nice and evenly with a thick coat of oil, and then went about assembling it. Now I decided to just spread the Loctite around the top edge of that steel intersection and not put it on the aluminum housing. And I also tried to just smear it evenly and lightly around the top half of it. I figured that way hopefully it wouldn't reach any further inside the housing there past where it should be, and it actually ended up working good. Once you set the ring down into the housing, you have to make sure that those screw holes are lined up perfectly. So that's what I'm doing here. And then I did put a little bit of Loctite on the screws again, but I used just the minimum amount that I thought would work. And then I could not find the torque specifications for these small bolts or screws, if you want to call them screws, anywhere on the internet or in my manual. So I just basically did what I felt was right, and I set my torque wrench to 4 foot-pounds. Anyway, I set my torque wrench to 4 and tightened those bolts down. Then I cleaned off the XS574, made sure that the surface was completely clean and dry. I used some solvent to do that. And then most importantly, checked it to make sure that those gears spun nice and easy inside the pump. And they did, thank goodness. So now it's time to put in the seal. I coated the inside where the seal goes in and the seal itself with some oil, and then set that seal on top of the pump as perfectly flat as it would sit, and then get out my bearing and race presser set. And I used one that was larger than the outside of the seal because you're supposed to put this seal in flush with the surface of the pump. It's tempting to want to pound this thing down until it seats against the backside of where it sits, but you don't want to do that. You're only supposed to press this thing down to the point where the seal itself is actually flush with the top. If you push it in too far, then what happens is it doesn't ride in the right spot on that drive that goes on the end of your crankshaft. If you push it in too deep, then the sealing surfaces don't match up and you'll end up with an oil leak. So hopefully that's okay, but there it is. And hopefully just having the sealant around the top is okay too. So I cleaned up the mounting surface for the pump real well. You can see some paper towels there where I stuffed in the holes so nothing would fall in there. And then I removed those paper towels. I took a camera and looked in there to make sure that there was absolutely nothing inside of there. Blew it out with some air. Then I took a look inside each one of the bolt holes to make sure that there was nothing in there. Then I took a bolt and threaded it in there to make sure that the bolt threaded into all the holes easily. Blew it out again just to make sure it was clean, and then cleaned the surface off with some brake parts cleaner to make sure that the surface was completely clean, and got out my new oil pump drive. I got the Porsche brand one because it was the same price as the aftermarket ones, and they all have this updated design where there is a recess there between the gear and the sealing surface. Here's all my cleaned up hardware, and I stuck them in this piece of cardboard in the shape that they go in the pump so I could keep them in order. To seal this, I'm using more 574, and then I cleaned the surface off of the oil pump and dried it to make sure it was perfectly clean and dry, and then started squirting on my 574. Now, it is recommended to use a foam roller to do this because you want basically the thinnest coat that you can get that is even on this surface. Like I said, I'd heard some horror stories about people putting this all together and still having leaks, so I decided to spread a little bit thicker layer on there with my finger. I tried to get it as thin as possible, but still have an even layer on there, and we'll see here in a little bit after we get it attached what happens when you have a little bit too much on there. I took a screwdriver and cleaned out the bolt holes just to get rid of as much excess as I could. And then I took all the bolts and put them in the pump so that they were in the pump already when I went to go and put it on the front of the motor. There's a lip that runs around the outside of that steel ring that fits into the round cutout section on the front of the engine block. So basically you just need to get the pump kind of clocked in the right spot so that all the bolt holes are as centered as possible. And then I started threading the bolts into the holes. I did it by hand and threaded them down till they were almost tight, then took my new oil pump drive and stuck it in and put it on the crankshaft and slid it in so that it helped center the pump. Then I could finish tightening down the bolts for the pump. The M6 bolts that have the 10mm head on them get torqued to 6 to 7 foot-pounds, and then the larger bolt that I believe uses a 17, could be an 18, but I think it's a 17, takes 33 foot-pounds. And then I just tried to tighten those, working from the center towards the outside in sort of a circular fashion until the thing was snug down, and then I torqued it down with my torque wrench until all the torque settings were correct. Here's a shot of where the pump meets the rail for the pan, and you can see that little extra bit of Loctite squeezes out. So you want to minimize that as much as you can, because you have to figure that if it's squeezing out on the edge on the outside, it's going to be doing it on the inside too, and you want to limit as much of that mixing with your oil as you can. So try to do an even layer but not apply too much at the same time. I cleaned that excess up as best as I could and called it good. And we'll get there in the future, but I can tell you that this worked. The oil pump actually has better pressure now than it did, and there are absolutely no leaks. Next episode, we're going to look at doing the balance shafts and probably the oil cooler. And after that, just continue taking an in-depth look at getting this thing completely put back together. Thanks for watching the show, guys. If you happen to be awesome, if you hit that subscribe button, I really appreciate it. And I hope you're all doing good out there in YouTube land. All right, see you next time.